Good evening. Welcome back to the hobby room. I'm just getting myself set up as I managed to hit go live slightly prematurely, but I think that's okay. I think we can survive, can't we? Let me turn the volume down on this so I don't echo back at myself. There we are. I can now see the chat. That's always helpful. Lovely stuff. And let's see what's happening on the Twitch as well. Over there, to my channel, and to dashboards. There we are, smashing stuff. Cool. So, first live stream post ChillCon, which was an awesome event. I've got a video coming out hopefully over the weekend, if not then certainly on Monday, about the event. Just kind of what I thought, what I did, what I saw, all the questions, and of course we'll talk a little bit about about how my mini did. I think most importantly, I was just really pleased with actually getting something done, if I'm honest. That was a rather big deal. So this evening, just working on another orc. There we go. I kind of had a look through the box and what's in progress, what's not in progress. So just adjusting the camera a little bit at the same time here, and realised this dude's been like half finished for a heck of a while. Almost a year, in fact. So time to get him finished. Sticking with kind of the same recipe for the skin, but hopefully just getting a slightly smoother finish. Some of the last, you may have noticed in the stream, some of the later layers just got a little bit. They started introducing sort of texture, which isn't an issue I've had massively before, but we shall learn from that. I'm hoping it was just a thinning or a medium issue or something. So yeah, same as last time. Started off with a sort of fairly dark base here. Then I'm going up through AK Intense Deep Green, Light Green, Frog Green, and then up to the model colour Ice Yellow mixed into that as the final highlight. Not as much skin on this dude though. There is, however, a lot of yellow armour, which I tried out here in like a stippling effect, and it's created quite a cool kind of patterning on the armour. I think what I now need to do is do some slightly more yellow work, and then go in with some kind of heavy weathering chips, metallic scratches through it. It's a lot more stippling and things like that. The metallics on this miniature aren't great. It's kind of I was going for like a really dark mucky steel. I think it just kind of comes across a bit drab, so instead I'm going to go over that with a dark aluminium, the metal colour, hit it with some dirty down rust, take that off, highlight it back up, use that same kind of fluorescent white effect that I used on that Orc's Axe the other day to kind of replicate that effect. How much I'll get through tonight, I really don't know, but well, let's get cracking and see where we end up. I think one thing I am going to need to do is re-establish this base coat on the skin. It's a bit patchy. Don't really want to work from a fundamentally flawed base coat. So I'm going to go back in with the Chimera Phthalo Green. Again, just really like working with the Chimera range. Such good paints, such reliable paints as well. Like, they're not gonna help you as such. You're gonna have to do a lot of work, but they are reliably consistent. You can, every time as long as I mix it, every time I get some paint out here, it is the same. Again, that sounds obvious, but we've all been there with many paint ranges where there's just weird things lurking in the pigment selection that just occasionally come out to cause you issues, often when you least need it. So yeah, let's start by getting this base coat properly established. I think it helps as well that the Phthalo Green is a much richer green than I was clearly using back when I base coated the skin for this dude. and therefore, especially on base coats like green, it really helps in terms of giving you headroom. Like, I don't know what green I was using when I base coated this, but it's quite almost like desaturated. Which is why I was looking at it and thinking, why on earth did I choose that? Like, I'm sure I had an idea for it at the time. Can't for the life of me remember it, and I can't remember ever wanting to paint desaturated dull orc skin. Um, as you've seen from these streams, when I do paint an orc, I like it to be, slap you in the face, slightly singe your eyes, bright fricking green. As I think all orcs should be. But hopefully you've had a good hobby week anyway. I'll tell you what, one thing that really stood out to me at ChillCon, I mean, I'll tell you now, but you must still watch the video when it comes out. One thing that really struck me was how obvious it was that it was a community event, and I don't mean that in the sense that, it was amateurish or, that bigger events do a better job. I mean it in the sense that everyone was just very community first. No one was just pushing wares on people. Everyone was happy just to take time and chat. And again, you would think, and I think quite reasonably, that's the same is true in all shows. And to an extent, that's true. But I find, and this is not necessarily a criticism, because I love Salute as an event, but I tend to find that vendors at Salute especially are looking to make serious sales. Not, if you're the right person and blah, blah, blah. Like, a lot of vendors, it's a decent outlay for them. They want return. Not unreasonable in any way, shape or form. That's why vendors go to events, whether or not everyone's willing to be honest about that. There's companies don't spend money to attend events and put on games for no reason. They want you to buy their stuff. Understanding that relationship, I think, is really key. I think the misunderstanding that relationship causes a lot of unnecessary and unreasonable grievance in our hobby. Particularly, yes, towards bigger companies like Games Workshop. Because I feel like often there is a mistake made when people start to think of companies as their friends. Companies are not your friends. Companies exist to take as much of your money as they can persuade you to hand them. A great way to do that is to be friendly. But they're not your friends. There is a distinct difference. And that obviously is still true at ChillCon. Of course it is. Again, vendors support community because community is good for them financially. However, I think just the overwhelming community feeling there kind of makes vendors adopt it themselves. Whether that's additional time taken to talk to you, whether that's actually just directing you, if you're looking for something and they know where it is, just proactively helping you. Little things that are almost certainly not going to convert you there and then. I mean, again, it's left me with a very good opinion of some vendors, so chances are it will convert for them, but less immediately, and I think maybe that's the difference. And you see this in events in other industries as well, right? I run a lot of learning and development events, and a lot of them are community and strictly no selling, etc., 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 and yet massive vendors still choose to get involved. They can't sell at the event, but of course they're just being involved in making the community strong leaves a good taste in people's mouths, for want of a better term. And so when people do need a whatever jigger or such and such a service, the company that previously has helped them without wanting money usually appears on their list of considerations. Now, I think probably beyond all of that, the standout thing for me at ChillCon was the smoothness of the event. There are a lot of big, expensive, staff-run events that are chaotic, unpleasant to be at, just really not well run in terms of the logistics on the day. Like, all the events like that, the one thing they have in common is lots of staff on the ground doing their absolute best. I have never known a member of staff in any event-related context going out of their own way to make people's, event worse. I have straight up never seen that. I don't think it really happens. What I do think happens is event staff, well, for one thing, there are never enough in large corporate run events, because staff are among the most expensive elements of running an event. That is often overlooked. In fact, I say often, it is almost always overlooked. I didn't really realise it properly until I was running events, and then sort of had the oh my god moment when I realised just how expensive it was going to be to staff a major event. And then really you're into the space of, insurance and venue and catering and all these other things. Now, community events have the benefit of they very rarely cater. Community events have the benefit of volunteer staff, so the costing goes away, but volunteers also inherently are giving their time up for free. Therefore, you're not going to have a massive number of them. On top of that, you are highly likely to find that your volunteers are not necessarily skilled event staff. They are just people who want to help. Sometimes it's actually better, but putting that aside in of itself, there's a real need to keep a handle on what's going on at the event throughout the day. There's a need to be constantly monitoring and checking. There's a need to, just keeping an eye on what's going on in the room, or in the case of ChillCon, across 3 halls. Not a small space. Like, we're not talking like exhibition halls, we are talking about school halls, but even so, that is not a small amount of space to keep an eye on, monitor, and make sure everything's running smoothly. And yet, going in, it's a bit of a queue, as one would expect from an event, especially a popular event like ChillCon. But even with the queue, I would say I got there right at the start of the day. I queued for no more than 15 minutes. I would say within a few minutes of the doors officially opening, I was inside. Very quickly got checked in. They had a really great system. They were using Eventbrite, which I always recommend when running an event. If you're not utilising your own event system, Eventbrite does a fantastic job of just making ticket ordering and management and communication and checking in on the day so easy. And sure enough, it did exactly that for ChillCon. Super easy process, took moments. I had paid for the swag bag ticket, so again, just showed my ticket, was given a bag. I was kind of thinking, oh great, this bag will be handy for anything that I pick up or collect or I handed on the day. Nope, that bag was full of stuff. To be clear, that is not a complaint. I just wasn't expecting quite as much stuff to be in there. A big part of the video that I'm putting out is actually me talking about how incredible the just the literal value in terms of what I walked out the door with was, setting aside the actual event. Like, there are very few events that are, certainly in my life, that I leave thinking, yeah, do you know what, I think I've got more here than what I actually paid for. Like, usually it's, well, I paid a premium, but that's events for you, and da 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 da. No, not this time. This full on had me walking away thinking, my goodness, I've spent barely any money and yet am leaving with all of this. That's really rare. That is super rare in the event space. Like, I'm not going to say that everything was cheap as such. Like, event food, look, there's just no way of getting around it. I had a really freaking expensive burger and chips, and it was absolutely fine. Like, it was no better than fine, but that's again totally okay. Like, it wasn't billed as a culinary experience. It was a wargaming event, you know. It was for people painting toy soldiers. It was an overpriced burger, but I think in the grand scheme of things, I've paid far more for far less or worse and worse food at an event. So I'm not going to. I'm not really going to be deducting points from them for their for the very yes, that's absolutely fine nature of a burger van. Like, I don't feel like that's a reasonable complaint to have at like a 40 quid ticket when I've walked out the door with easily over 100 quid's worth of stuff, I think, in the, certainly by my maths anyway, in the bag. There's optimistic and wanting things to be great, and then there's actually just taking the mick. I mean, in short, I think it's one of the best events, certainly one of the best run events I've ever been to. It's kind of made me start thinking about, hey, you know, this is totally something that can be done. You know, is there something that could be done down in my neck of the woods? Because literally my only criticism is the fact that Derby is a hell of a long way from Swindon. Like, that was the only part of the day I could have done without, was having to travel so far to get there. And in the Grant, yeah, again, it's one of those kind of, can't really blame the organisers for geographic sort of location differences between me and the event. The event ultimately is my choice whether or not to go. But again, even with that in mind, if it's Chester, if it's Derby again next year, I would definitely go. Like, it would absolutely not stop me, and I don't think, like, if it's something that you're considering, but you're a long way away, I would strongly suggest to you that it is worth the trip. Yeah, I mean, it's just phenomenal. I mean, the fact that it's a community-run event, and yet you had people like Chris Peach, Louise Sugden, Dave from MS Paints, all these people there getting involved. Kind of, you know, some of them, like Dave offering up some time at the hobby clinic and things like that. But mostly just, you know, wandering about, entering the painting competition, winning the painting competition, unsurprisingly in Louise's case. You know, I think it speaks a lot that they are attending not as, you know, attractions, but choosing to. You know, that's a big deal, I think. You know, I think when you've got people that are ex-GW, you know, they know they know how to run a hobby event. Like, no matter what you want to say about GW, and again, I think people largely speak unfairly out of that misunderstanding of what the relationship is. GW being a business and not your friend. Yeah, I think it's, you know, I think it speaks volumes as to the quality of the event. Just going to go in again with this second coat. I'm definitely going to have to touch up some yellow, but that's totally okay. Like, this was never a finished set of armour, and again, you already kind of knew that this was ultimately going to result in me needing to try something a little bit different. There we go. When it came time to when it came time to paint the rest of this up. Right, there we are, back to the face. I must admit, there is something, for me personally, very therapeutic about painting slightly larger miniatures. Like, not necessarily scale larger, but just big, chunky miniatures like this orc. I think it's just the simplicity of the shapes. Like, I can see pretty much exactly what is what. Which again sounds really simple and basic, right? But actually, being able to see all the parts of the miniature is not a guarantee quite often these days. Often find there's so much detail on these things that you end up spending half your life looking for the or trying to figure out what's going on. There we go. Let's do a bit more of a zoom on you. There we are. So that's a decent amount of coverage on that skin. See, that skin gets a lot darker once you start mixing the phthalo and this in, but it's going to be just a case of very slowly working it up. Don't want to make great big jumps. Don't want to start accidentally sort of adding texture by using too thick a paint. And again, kind of just like I was practicing before, I just want to sort of sketch with the brush at the minute rather than be super careful. Like, you know, put the brush in more or less the right place and yada yada yada, all that good stuff, but certainly not yet at the point where I'm going to start worrying about anything to do with kind of sort of really complex shapes or volumes or sort of where highlights need to go. Much more interested in just kind of getting some foundational colour on there and making sure it goes on with a nice smooth coat. I think that was, that was kind of like my big lesson from Chilcon, was that you can put in a lot of effort and not win, and that's fine. Knew that already. But I think painting wise, it was a case that you can put in a lot of time, and actually sometimes if you don't get just certain key bits right, it almost then doesn't matter how much effort you put in beyond that point. That miniature has some fundamental problems with how I approach certain stages of the painting, or more specifically how I rushed them. And I think that's why I ended up with texture in there. I rushed a few somewhat key moments, and ultimately paid the price for doing it quite harshly. Like, and it is what it is. I'm not worried about not placing in the competition. More just a case of making sure that I learn from it. I tell you what, this does not really work very well. The Red Grass Game painting handle does not work very well if you've got like a miniature that doesn't really fit. I'm just gonna switch it out for just a cheap wooden one, to be honest, because it's cheap and it's naff, but you know what? It'll absolutely do the trick. And what's more, I think it will probably do the trick an awful lot better than the Redgrass Games one. Now, I made some iffy choices on the basing for this mini. I chose to use the coconut corking, and it's not great. I know some people absolutely swear by it, and I've got tons of the stuff, and it's fine, but I kind of did a bit of an experiment here with some little clumps of it, and they are just coming off. Despite the fact that this model has been undercoated in a polyurethane undercoat. It has been it's had like a zenithal airbrush of white ink that has also then dried over elements on it, and so and then it's obviously been paint. It's had several coats of collective paint in various points of the miniature. The fact that there's still basing material coming off tells me that it just doesn't actually stick very well. I tell you what, one thing I've noticed, the Series 7 brushes that I've got at the minute are just awful. Like, I love Series 7 brushes. They are almost always my go-to. Like I said, I've been experimenting recently with a couple of different types, and the Raphael 404s I thought were dreadful. And I don't mean that in an absolute kind of they are universally bad brushes. I know there are amazing painters out there who probably swear by them. Though I would hazard a guess that those same amazing painters would be among the first to point out the fact that they are not amazing painters because of the brushes they use. What they are is, and even like I say this now, this brush had a marvellous point at one point, or at some time. If it no longer does, I am probably the reason. But I've got to just say, it lost its point, or has lost its point, so quickly. Like, these are not old brushes. These brushes are maybe 6 months old, and they have not seen enough use in that time for me to be comfortable with them, having reached a point where I've got my money's worth. That's always, with brushes, that is always my concern, is am I getting whatever the cost was of the brush back? It's the reason I tend to end up being quite willing to spend large sums on brushes, because broadly speaking, you do get what you pay for when it comes to brushes. And that does not mean that you can only paint well with a good brush. I mean, hell, I don't paint well and I've got good brushes. It kind of kills that argument, right? But what I can't stand, and this is kind of like a carryover from my day job, I can't stand tools that actively get in your way. In the corporate L&D world, there are tons of tools that we use that are just awful. They're poorly designed, they deliver bad work, they promote bad practices. Chances are that is the reason why when you have to do your annual compliance training, it's some god-awful PowerPoint style e-learning with some next buttons. The tools that your L&D team are using are pants. And often, just to be clear, that's not their fault. Businesses or organisations supporting the businesses often make these decisions for the L&D department. Usually with the kind of, don't worry, we know what we're doing, we've done this before. And then when, it all falls apart, said consultants are, of course, long gone, having bagged a nice healthy day rate and crept out of the nearest window as soon as there was a suggestion that someone was going to start measuring how performant these changes actually were. But back to model painting. All I ever really want from a brush is that it doesn't get in my way, that it isn't so bad that I use it for 20 minutes and end up with a hook tip. I don't want it to be constantly splitting. I don't want it to be constantly dropping hairs into the paint. That's a much bigger deal than one might think. We're just starting now to kind of sketch definition into the muscles. At the minute, it is a bit floating muscly, but I know floating muscle effect is not for everyone. It's not everyone's cup of tea at all, but that's okay. It doesn't have to be everyone's cup of tea. It's my cup of tea. I like big, cartoony orcs. That is just what I like when it comes to painting me an orc. And I think that's like painting on the live stream in the run up to ChillCon. I think that was kind of my big thing, actually. Was that realization that, do you know what, actually, this is what I enjoy. These are the parts of the painting process that I want to spend time doing, that I want to talk about, how they impact me, my enjoyment of the hobby, my happiness in general, all that sort of stuff. What I don't want to talk about is X, Y, and Z. And so I just won't. I just either won't paint that bit, or won't use that approach, or that style, or... Because this was largely my thinking behind whether or not to attempt some kind of non-metallic metal on that other orc for the ChillCon competition. And ultimately, I decided that no, I would not do that. I wouldn't normally do that. Yes, I'm going to a painting competition, but I'm not going to try and win. So why take on a bunch of additional efforts for something that I'm not doing because I'm not doing because I want to do it for the enjoyment. I'm doing it purely because it's a painting competition that I don't really mind about whether or not I win. Like you see how very quickly you can't really help but come to the conclusion that something here doesn't really make sense. And for me, that was just an opportunity to go, hey, hang on a minute. Why am I even considering that? I've said since getting back into the hobby, I'm not getting back into it in a competitive sense. I'm getting back into it to reconnect with old friends, to have some quiet hobby time that I can structure when working from home. And so that I can, create content and share it with you. That's the point. This channel, really, the content side of that whole discussion is about giving myself a very strong reason to do hobby, which sounds daft, but we all know that with work, with family, all these other everyone's got commitments, right? We all like to say, I want to spend all my spare time painting toy soldiers, but none of us can, right? Because then when we do get a day off, we've got stuff to do in the house, we've got family that we want to see, we've got, I don't know, these days maybe it's another job, or maybe you just, like me, bring a lot of work home from the office. There's a very legitimate reason that a lot of people, as we all know, take a break from the hobby. I did, like, best part of 10 years. It's, it seems to be pretty much the standard path. Like, I don't know many people who have never taken a sort of break from the hobby. Sort of even people who are massively into it. I think, there is still, life. There is still family. There is still friends. There is still, actually, come the end of the week, tiredness. Let's be honest. Certainly for me, that's the case. Like, I'm often knackered at the end of the week. The idea of, oh yes, I'll just go and paint some orcs or a dwarf or whatever, is just like, yeah, no, I'm gonna go and lie down. Ideally for a few days, and then, if unfortunately someone needs to wait me to do something, I'll deal with that. But it's I think pretty common for people to not really want to spend their weekends doing a kind of highly engaged, highly time-consuming hobby. Which this is. Massively time-consuming, massively expensive, massively, at times, lonely. Like for many people, where the hobby is just painting, which is a decent number of people, especially these days, like that can be a pretty lonely thing to just sit. Obviously, there are opportunities to, paint with friends, etc., 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 but ultimately, day to day, for most of us, painting is a solo enterprise. Especially for me, like that's kind of where I've put. That's the bit of the hobby that I've got back into. And I think that's probably how it's going to stay. I would play a game of Old World if it was offered. I'm quite interested to have a go at that. But I've got no interest in getting back into like 40k or something like that. Looking at the rules, they're a little bit verbose for me these days. But that's all right. The game can be for other people. That's totally fine. Yeah, this is starting to come together now. As I'm now pretty much at this point just applying plain deep green. It's not really got much by way of the phthalo left in it at this point. At this stage, it's kind of more just got enough phthalo in it to enrich it, and that's about it. It's doing fingers, knuckles. I think one of the many things that this approach to painting orcs does is just allow you to slap paint on the mini. Like, it doesn't, yes, the muscles lack the gradient that stretched and sinuous muscle would have, and yes, there are issues around exactly how the light is getting into the side of this and why that would be as bright as it is and all these things, but actually when it comes down to it, it's just a big green orc. And when I slap him in the cabinet when he's done, I'll stick him in there next to a bunch of other orcs, and they'll all be there, and they'll all be bright green with great big axes, and it'll look great. And that's fine. For me, at least. Like, that's sufficient. I don't need it to do more than that. I just need it to make me happy while I'm painting it, and then, maybe if I get really lucky, it'll make someone else happy when they see it. But that's it. That's all it's there to do. And I think once you kind of, or at least for me, once I accepted that was what I cared about in the hobby. Not so much being the best painter, but just getting to a point where painting made me happy, where I was no longer stressing about what should I use, what should I do, what technique. Just getting to the point where I can pick up a paintbrush, grab a model, grab some paints, and immediately just think, yep, this is great. Doesn't matter how it goes, doesn't matter if I get the miniature finished, doesn't matter if this new technique that I'm trying out works out or not. It's all irrelevant. It's just an opportunity to have frickin' fun. Yeah, it's one of those things where it makes me very happy to paint like that. I think it's a lot more fun. Cool, so that's where we get up to with the just going through phthalo, couple of mixes, and then finally up to deep green. So then we're heading into the light green space. Probably 2 mixes in between this and pure light green. But already here you can kind of see the level of greenness that we're once again shooting for. Like, if needs be, that could be this done. Like, this is perfectly fine. But I'll be honest, I'm not a bit, if I'm gonna paint miniatures, I much prefer to paint them kind of to a slightly beyond tabletop standard. I'm not going to claim it's like a high standard, just, something beyond tabletop tends to be the goal. So next up, as I say, light green. These again, just the AK colours are just so good. Such a consistency coming out of the bottle between all the paints. Again, I think a bit like before, that it's something that gets overlooked and very much underappreciated. It kind of really irks me whenever I see the whole yes, well, it doesn't really matter arguments around, which paint should you use and da da da. Like, it does matter. It matters massively. That's why people keep asking it. Like, some paints are inherently better than others, but also sometimes there's just when people go, oh, there's a preference piece involved. So of course there's a preference piece involved, but just saying, oh, there's no such thing as a best paint, blah blah blah, it's not true. There is a best paint. There's a best paint for everyone in every project. What it is highly personalised. It's not actually all that difficult. The only way to find out, though, is to get a whole bunch of paint and start using it and see which one you like. It makes it a very difficult thing to talk about in... what's the right word? When you're not the user, in abstraction, but it's not actually a difficult question in of itself. For this, I'm trying now, when I get to this stage, to work in very sort of stroping lines to give the effect of muscle being pulled taut. Like, it doesn't, there are areas where that is easier than others. But immediately, actually, going in with this, I can see kind of how I'm thinking this will end up working out. At least I hope. That's always the caveat with these things, unfortunately, is they could change. There we are. At that point, we're just starting to get to the point where things stand out a little bit. I think that starts to look quite cool. Again, kind of painting incredibly bright space orcs is not always, what's the right word, in fashion. But I feel like there's always a place for it with orcs. Like, there's not, well, just recently there's been a lot of interest in kind of like quasi-nostalgic marine painting from kind of 2nd and 3rd edition. And to be clear, like, I'm not criticising that, like, I think it's cool. I don't, however, whilst we talk about, oh, it's a whole style of painting to go back and be like that and blah, 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 I don't see many armies coming out in that format at this point. I could be talking rubbish, but I strongly suspect that we're looking at one of those kind of trends that is a trend among Instagrammers and not particularly among those who actually gather in various places around various countries at the weekend and roll dice to kill each other's toy soldiers. Like, that doesn't, to me, it doesn't seem that we've got the same movement, shall we say. There we go. I think one of the things that I rather like about this miniature, if I'm honest, and this is a rarity for me with Games Workshop, if I'm honest, because I usually have, and you may have heard me say it before, kind of the same repeated criticism of miniatures just being too detailed. And I get that, you know, for some people that's a ridiculous idea. You know, miniatures should be as close to real life as possible. More detail is better. Blah, blah, blah. All this stuff, perfectly legitimate position to hold. I do, however, completely disagree with you. I think models aren't meant to be, or were never meant to be, like miniature, like scale miniatures. They're not designed to be realistic. They're not designed to look right. They're designed to sort of make us emote to a certain situation, to cast us to the idea of a huge green orc with an axe and this big ramshackled armour. I don't need to know how tall the orc is. He looks quite big. I don't need to know the detail and the history of the horns. They're just there. They look cool. That's enough. And I quite like this. Like, it's got bits. It's got chain cloak and these horns and sigils. It's got this banner pole. We've got this quite sort of specific armor look. We've got stormcast heads. But all of them are done in a relatively simple way. And for me, that's just like that's the key right there. Like, that is the whole thing. Get that right. You know, just give people an easy time of it. To me, that's just an easy way to win in anything that you're doing. So, just going in with a bit more of a mix this time. Just added some more medium as well, just to keep everything flowing. So that's one thing that I think I will be carrying on with for the foreseeable future, at least, is just that mixing with part water, part medium, and really just enjoying the smoothness that it gives, and how easy it is with it. I think that's the bit around mediums that people aren't talking about. People are often talking about highly specialist mediums. Noosh is a perfect example from Procryl. You know, it does an incredible job, really, really well. But for most of us, it's not actually all that useful. And that's fine. You know, in the same way that I didn't find the mold line remover to be a useful tool, I have absolutely no reason. Why? Because I can buy a knife. I'm actually able to just buy a knife. That product gets so much kind of hate for how stupid it is and how no one will ever buy one. I bet Games Workshop sold an obscene number of mold line removers. Because I remember being a kid, being in a store, needing to remove mold lines, and having to use files on plastic miniatures. Because, I mean, the staff, in fairness, quite rightly, weren't going to sell me a knife and weren't going to lend me one of theirs. I was under 16 or 18 or whatever when I was there. You know, they didn't want to be responsible for me having a knife. And, you know, ultimately, the mold line remover means kids do not need to beg their parents to buy them a knife or files or other expensive equipment. They can just pull on what's in the shop. Cool. Well, he's already looking much more orky, much greener. I think now we are approaching, he says, we are approaching the point of the green where I'm going to need to start thinking about a bit of recess shading, a bit of evening out, a bit of all the stuff you have to think about when you start approaching completion. Still got a good way to go. I've only just come out of deep into light, now going all the way up to light. A little bit more, there we go. That's another thing that I picked up at ChillCon was one of these Tom's Tabletop Bunker mugs, and on this side, perfect happy hobby. I think couldn't have a better message for how I'm re-engaging with this now, and just focusing on the little bits of the hobby that bring me a little bit of joy. There we go. Now at the point with the skin where I'm just starting to think a little bit about kind of, okay, well, you know, where would this highlight sit and how would it affect the overall volume as opposed to just where I'm placing the highlight. And I think this is equally one of those times where I always think that it's at this stage of painting this orc flesh recipe that you pay if you have sped through or not really put the work in to the layers below, because it starts to become a little bit obvious whether or not you've whether or not you're meant to be there, as it were, whether or not you're skipping or putting time into each phase very carefully, just adding tiny thin layers, or if you're just chucking paint onto the miniature. Certainly for me, I always try and avoid the just chucking paint on, but at the same time, like my my painting competition entry, it was a prime example. It suffered from, oh my god, I'm behind, chuck paint on the miniature syndrome. I mean, hell, I was painting it on stream the night before the competition. It's not ridiculous to point out the fact that that is not sort of conducive to a serious entry. In that sense, quite lucky. Obviously, wasn't really that serious about it, but I think moving forwards there is a case to be made, at least in my mind, for, you know, taking the competitions a little more seriously, not necessarily from a wanting to win them perspective, but just making sure that, you know, my miniature's done in, I would not say in plenty of time, but just in time for the event proper, like not painting the night before, that kind of thing, you know? There we go. Because that's why I actually, in the video, you'll see I ran into some trouble with the miniature and had to, you know, not the breakage itself was not particularly an issue. You know, a little bit of a stop on the motorway, heard it break in the box, checked it that night. Varnish layers had all held up everywhere, which was great, and it also meant that, you know, the paint job was in no way, or the paint job of the miniature was in no way affected. What I had failed to think about was the fact that I had varnished both the plinth and the miniature, different varnishes, importantly, and that neither of these varnishes really had time to fully set before this happened, and that was going to cause some problems. And I feel like that's kind of what's the right term? Kind of felt about right, if I'm honest. There we go. You're starting to see now as that skin comes together. Very, very bright, very saturated. That's where are we up to? That's just pure light green at that stage. We kind of zoom in a bit. Hopefully, you'll be able to. There we go. Get a pretty good feel for how he's looking, and again with that, just using really, really thin paints, so that it's quite easy to kind of have the layers below coming through, kind of just like we have with actual skin. I always try and take that approach whenever painting sort of an organic surface, because organic surfaces tend to absolutely not be absolute. They don't tend to be perfect. They have a strong tendency to be messy and, you know, incomplete and all these other things that in miniature painting we would kind of be a little aghast to see. But if we want to, you know, in some way mimic some form of nature, or at least some believable element of it, shall we say, then we've got to just adopt a similar approach in terms of, oh, there we go, in terms of just thinking about kind of what the composition of things are. Like, skin is not one cohesive thing, it's lots of little layers of stuff. Therefore, let's paint skin with that kind of idea in mind. Now, you know, is it going to magically look like real skin? No, of course it's frickin' not. Like, this isn't about becoming like some kind of loon. It's just about, you know, using everything we've got around us in the world, the living world, just to guide those sorts of decisions, to make us think, hang on a minute, how does you know, what does a beetle's wing actually look like before I paint this plague ship, or whatever it might be that you're painting. Any opportunity to kind of tie it into a real world thing, it becomes a little more real. You know, when we like some of the most interesting miniatures I ever saw was an orc army, and it was all painted, the whole thing, in different shades of butterflies. Now, butterflies and orcs may not sound like they have much in common, but the argument, because I was chatting with a guy who painted them at the time, his whole argument was basically like, these are plants. Orcs, grow from fungus. I assume this is still the official law, as it were, and that's why they spread, and they seem to just pop up, because they kind of do. They spread and they pop up and they grow and then they become orcs. There we go. That's lovely in green. And I think there's, real opportunity when painting things like orcs, when painting things like horses, when painting things like Kroot, to look at the natural world and say, hey, how would this work? What colour would this end up being if it was, I don't know, on this kind of island in this environment? What sort of thing would it would evolve? What things would it have to have? And with that, then you can go and you can look at various, like, real creatures from the environment that you're thinking about, and then from that you can start to just think about, okay, so what elements of that am I going to pull in to my miniature? Perhaps it's the whole thing. Perhaps the whole colour scheme gets decided that way. That's what it was for the orcs in the case of the butterfly orcs, but that doesn't make it the right way. The right way could be that there's various beetle forms. Beetles have the most incredible iridescence to their to their bodies. They almost look metallic at times. At this stage, I'm just half shading the most exposed parts of the muscle. Not really sure if that would get any light, but I think it probably would get a little. This piece at the front is probably the piece that I'm most worried about, but I think it's okay. I think it's passable. It'll certainly not it'll not cause us problems further down the line. One thing that never gets old with this stuff, I must admit, is this incredible sense of kind of focus, but also just relaxation. Like, I want to do a good job, I want to make this miniature look nice, but at the same time, very open to the fact that, it's just a miniature. Like, if I do something wrong, if I royally mess it up, the world's gonna be fine. Like, there's no downside to messing it up. Just a little bit of frustration on my own part. So the other really great thing is that at this stage I'm starting to pull in, of course, the frog green. Frog green is just the most intense yellowy green. I just love it personally. It is not, however, a colour that everyone enjoys looking at. It is hyper intense. I would be the first to admit that it's a hyper intense colour. Thus, with this kind of usage, I'm kind of just keeping it on the most exposed exposed elements, hands and knuckles, etc. Even then, just keeping a really close eye on who's doing what and where. There we go. That's probably the most of that we're going to see put on in one coat. There we go. That immediately now, that frog green just really pops it. And now this is where I like to start thinking about different options around what can be done, different options around how we go about sort of really thinking about the kind of different colours that we might want in the shade, because I think there's a lot to potentially enjoy when it comes to bringing in sort of different, more unusual shades. So for instance, we're gonna start putting in some purples at this point. It may seem a little odd to be sort of putting purple into this, but I always feel that it works really well. So I always tend to reach for the same sort of one, this dark rusto colour. It's incredibly rich, incredibly saturated, and incredibly dark. All of which really helps with what we're trying to do here. So I'm just going to give that a good shake and pick off this dry paint from the top so that doesn't end up stuck in my wash. Had that recently, that was a right pain. And for doing this, I mean, I just use like the tiniest little... Oh, that's actually way too much. There we go. But hey, we've now got absolutely tons of that paint in there, and when I say tons, I mean that is, I mean, that is a ridiculous amount of this paint. I do not need anywhere near that. But then all I do is grab the Vallejo glazing medium, give that a very good shake. And to be clear, you could totally just make this yourself. Slightly different mix of this stuff. This is thinner than that. The reason I do quite like this though is the dropper bottle, where I can just come in and say, okay, I want to make this a glaze. Let's absolutely douse it in glaze medium. And I mean, I always just use like an old Citadel brush. And you can see there the paint very quickly overcomes the paling effect of the glaze. And then in my case, because I don't want to add too much of that, I'm just going to start adding water. That's still actually quite a distance off. So I'm going to go in with a little squirt bottle of water. There we are. I think that'll be enough now. And with this, I'm always just looking for an actual watery goop. I mean, that is still actually... This gives you an idea of how strong this paint is. With all that, it is still just a little bit too thick. What I am going to do, add a little water, and then just as the last thing, I'm going to go in with a little bit of, if I can find it, nope, I'm looking for, there it is, airbrush thinner. And what this does is just mean that the glaze will have no surface tension, pretty much, and will pretty exclusively go where I put it. It does, however, also introduce a really terrible smell. And we can see there now on the side by comparison Like there is just, it just runs away now, whereas before it lingered. So let's get that off there. And what I always like to do with this is just get a relatively small brush, dip it in, wipe it off on the side. Really, actually, this is completely the wrong brush to be trying to do that with. I've just realised how big that brush is. There we go. That was not the brush I thought it was. There we go. Really tiny brush. And just drop this into the deepest areas, the very deepest recesses. And I'd like to use it especially in the places where the green meets another colour or kind of naturally falls into shadow, if that makes sense. And you can really see the effect when you're doing this of adding that airbrush thinner. Like, it plays a huge role in making this work. Because the minute you've got surface tension in this, it becomes very difficult to get behind his ears. It becomes very difficult, I find, to get it in exactly the right place with every brushstroke. Whereas with no surface tension or very low surface tension, it wants to go where you want to put it. Like all of a sudden, me and the paint are trying to achieve the same thing. We may not always succeed, but we're trying to achieve the same thing. That's the main thing, right? And just drop these in. There we are. That really just helps pick up the just introduce a kind of interesting tone to the green, rather than it all just being one sort of uber green. We now have a little bit of green, a little bit of, like the hint of purple somewhere in there. That's always my thing, is that I don't want this stuff to be like, oh Christ, there's purple there. I want it to be like, it almost looks like there's a bit of a reflected purple shadow in some of these areas. Like, that's the level of intensity I'm looking for from this thing. It's not about painting the thing purple. It's about just having something a little bit more interesting than green. And it tends to always work quite well. I'm going to just do a little bit on some of the armour as well, actually, because it makes a real difference to have this stuff in early. And this armour, I think, suffers quite specifically from the fact that there's no sort of, or I find it very difficult, I should say, as opposed to there is no. But I find it very difficult to get a lot of sort of reaching depth into yellow. Like, it tends to inherently become slightly sort of monotonal in many ways. And this is, just kind of just an opportunity to just maybe redress that a little bit, to consider, hey, why don't we do it this way? Why don't we just try adding a whole bunch of purple? And if it looks dreadful, it looks dreadful. That's absolutely fine. I can always just, ultimately, I can always just paint over it. It's just paint. Like, it's not as if it's super thick or super strong. Like, the pigment's incredibly strong, but as mentioned, it's not sort of, what's the right word? It's not currently necessary for it to remain on the surface, which is quite nice. It just kind of flows away because the well, just because of that lack again of surface tension from the airbrush thinner helping it out. So yeah, I'm going to call that there before I add too much. I always tend to get carried away. In fact, I'm going to slightly feather out some of these areas so they don't dry bright purple. It's the only thing you got to kind of look out for with this thing is if you leave big blotches of purple, they're going to be purple. And that's not really the name of the game here. That the point is to try and just introduce some little odd patches of sort of tone as opposed to actual colour. There we are, that's better now. And hey, that may have almost no effect on the yellow, but it's nice to try out, and I know it'll have a very positive effect on the green, just to again give it a bit more depth, make it a bit more lively, and sort of, yeah, just kind of push those darkest shadows back, because I tend to find that as I sort of bring it up layer by layer, you start to lose depth pretty quickly. Sweet. So I mean, that's kind of like an hour of Orky painting. So I am gonna say that for tonight, that's done. He's looking good. He's heading in the right direction, but still an awfully long way to go. I'm gonna stream probably again over the weekend, Saturday and Sunday, and then maybe try and get him finished on Sunday. I think we'll just have to see what time is looking like. But thank you very much for joining me today. Do come back over the weekend and see as the first, I think pretty much the first proper video on the public channel. I mean, everything up till this point has kind of been live streams, a box opening, you know, nothing, no proper content as it were. So very exciting to have something coming out on the channel, and I shall see you all again at some point soon. Enjoy your hobby.